Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Book Passage. Thank you for coming out on a Friday evening before the holiday and supporting your local independent bookstore. We really value when you come out to these events and support not only the independent spirit, but the wonderful authors we are able to host here. My name is Melissa Sestaro, and I have the honor of introducing award-winning journalist and best-selling author Frank Bruni. Frank is the author of the memoir Born Round, The Secret History of a Full-Time Eater, and Ambling into History, The Unlikely Odyssey of George W. Bush. He is currently the New York Times op-ed columnist, and prior to that he was the chief restaurant critic for the Times as well. He comes to us this evening with this wonderful, important, and timely book, Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be, an antidote to the college admissions mania. And this is really a topic that so many of us can relate to right now, and the kind of book that every parent with a student heading to college should have on their bookshelf. It is also an indispensable book for students who will be venturing out into the vast landscape of college application madness. It is with great pleasure that we welcome Frank Bruni to Book Passage this evening.
Hey, thank you all for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. I'm not going to read, and I'm going to steal a line that you told me that Jeanette Walls used, which is, because you can all read plenty well yourselves, right? And I'm not going to talk that long because I'd much rather have a conversation, and I assume that some of you have some questions about the book, or we can talk about anything. In my column, I write about politics, I write about culture, so we can chat about restaurants if you want. But I'll just introduce the book a little bit and tell you a little bit about where I come from and why I wrote it and that sort of thing. So I grew up in a suburb not that different from this one, and it was my experience at the time that the college admissions process was plenty anxious and people spent way too much time thinking about it even then. In our suburb, everyone advertised where their kids were going to college on the back windows of their cars. Is that still the case here? Okay. And so the audio soundtrack of my growing up was my mother reading the names of the stickers and commenting. So we'd be driving to dinner and I would hear Dartmouth, Amherst, Stanford. Oh, they did really well. Or she'd read something else and she'd sigh in sympathy with how their lot had been worse. My mother, I went to a private school. It was actually a prep school. I was a day student there, and my mother did very well sticker-wise. My older brother went to Amherst. My younger brother went to Dartmouth. My youngest sibling, a sister, went to Princeton, and then I ruined the sticker bonanza by going to UNC Chapel Hill. And we can talk later about why I did that, if you like. If you had told me then that was a pale precursor to the frenzy and the obsessiveness that attends this process now, I would have said that was impossible. But over recent years, as my 11 nieces and nephews, I had very fecund siblings, as my 11 nieces and nephews began to get into the latter years of high school and go through this process, as I watched the children of friends go through this, my mind was simply blown away by what I saw. I never imagined we would live in a country where people were paying $50,000 to private consultants who sign on when your kid's in the 8th grade and basically help you make every decision from that point forward, as if the entire point of education in life is to impress the admissions committee at Princeton. If you had told me that there would be robust businesses run by people who hold essay writing camps, where people spend $14,000 to send their kids for 3 days to have someone guide them through all of this essay writing, I would have said that was impossible. I tell a story in the book that's sort of funny and sort of sad that I think captures this. An Ivy League professor I know very well was recounting some relatives of his, people he didn't know super well, but well enough that they could come visit him. And they brought their daughter, who was a senior in high school, to his office. And the clear goal was to show her off and impress him, and then maybe he would send an email to the admissions committee or pick up the phone and say, I just met the most amazing young woman, we must have her here at, I'm not going to say the university's name, but it's a good one. He was recounting to me how her parents were, saying, tell him about your grades, and they went through that, tell him about your standardized test scores. She talked about that, go through your extracurriculars. And they were seeming increasingly desperate, like, have we done everything we can possibly do, to impress him? Have we gone through the treasure chest of her charms and picked out every last jewel and bauble? And then they realized they hadn't, and the mother turned to the daughter and said, don't forget to tell him how you're president of your high school survivors of bulimia society. I think that pretty much sums up where we are in terms of people feeling there is no point too far that you can go to try to getting into a highly selective school matters so much that there's no humiliation too far, there's no boast too weird, there's nothing you can do that makes yourself stand out that you shouldn't do. Another story that kind of blew me away that I encountered when I was reporting and writing the book was a talk to a lecturer at Cornell. And I can't remember how I found my way to him, but I knew he was concerned with these issues as I was. And he teaches every year a class of 200 students, mostly juniors and seniors, some sophomores, no freshmen. So all of them are at least a year and probably 2 or 3 years past the college admissions process. And just as a sort of experiment, every year he looks out at the class and he says, how many of you are upset that you're not at Harvard or Yale? And he said, pretty much routinely, 60% of the students raise their hands. They're at Cornell University. They're in the Ivy League, but that's not good enough. They're not at Harvard, Princeton, Yale, MIT, Stanford. That's how status conscious we've let higher education become. That's what I think we all really need to push back against. I think we need to ask some hard questions about what sort of values we're teaching kids when we exhort them toward this particular goal, and when we lead them through the paces that many of them go through to reach this goal. I'll tell you one more story that speaks to what I'm talking about in terms of values we're creating, and then let's just have a conversation. You guys ask me questions, but I taught at Princeton last year. This time last year, I was teaching a writing seminar of 16 students at Princeton. And because its subject was food writing, it was very popular, and 48 kids applied. And what they do at Princeton when that's the case is they ask them all to write a letter of application to the professor, and then they let the professor choose the students. So I got the 48 letters, and I read them, and I was really struck by how charming they were, how much verve they had, polish. I was really thinking, wow, I chose my 16 students, and about halfway through the semester, it occurred to me that most of the students in the class had not written for me anything as good as the letter of application. And I even, just to be sure that I wasn't misremembering, I even went back to the file I had in my laptop of the letters, and I read the letters of the 16 students who were in the class, and it confirmed my suspicion. And so I started, as I mingled with faculty members who had been at Princeton, who were there full-time and knew the student body much better than I did, I started saying, I noticed the most amazing thing, and I would repeat this observation. And to a person, every professor said, well, that doesn't surprise me at all. And I said, well, why not? And they said, we have taught these kids that the point of everything, that the most glorious accomplishment is getting in to an exclusive realm. They saw your course listed. They realized right away, because they recognized your name maybe because it was food writing, that this was going to be a competitive situation, another culling, and they marshaled their best selves and their best energy to best the competition and get into it. And once they got in, well, they were finished. That was it. It was done. And they said they see that in the students at the university, and they said that's why, in their view, and I think this feels to me like it must have some truth to it, they said that's why they think so many of the students at Princeton and at Harvard and at other schools of that ilk go into management consulting and into the finance industries. It's not just that they're looking for big paydays, although they're looking for big paydays. That's the next competition, that's the next culling. And the rhythm of their life has been about besting the competition to get exclusive things. We are equating exclusivity with quality when it comes to higher education. I think that's patently ridiculous, and I think it's toxic. And I hope some of the issues I bring up in the book, I hope our conversation tonight maybe helps to be the beginning of changing the way we think and talk about these things. And with that, I will throw it back to you. What do you want to talk about? No one ever wants to be the first, but then you end up, thank you, sir.
You were
A college classmate
you
of
were
my
a
father's.
food writer for the New York Times.
Huh?
You wrote about food restaurants.
I did.
When you were doing that, did you have the opportunity for free meals at some of these restaurants, or did they not?
Did I have the opportunity for free meals? They were all free.
They were offered.
Well, they were all. We paid for them all, but they were all paid for by the Times.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, my question is, why would you ever leave a job like that?
When you have to eat out, two answers. When you have to eat out every night, when that becomes an obligation as opposed to something you're doing volitionally, it can feel like a bit of a treadmill, although a treadmill that makes you fat rather than thin. Also, when you're stuck in that subject zone, you run out of synonyms for succulent. You just have to name it. Yeah,
If you had to write a book now,
I did.
if you had to write a book now that was the opposite of what you've written, why you want to go to the best or the ones that are thought, the schools that are thought the best, what would you say?
Well, I would say that because of their endowments, because of their wealth, because of their ability to attract many of the best faculty, Harvard, Princeton, I mean, we can go through the list of 25 schools, are amazing, amazing schools. And if they're approached in the right way, by the right kind of student, and used well, and that's a big if they're used well, they're almost peerless institutions. And yes, they will, at least in the beginning of your career, they may well give you a leg up. The problem, and the reason why I wouldn't want to write that book, and I very much wanted to write this book, is the way we talk about things in this country right now, in certain communities, and communities of privilege mostly, but really this conversation I think fans out everywhere. We have created the impression that those schools are almost the only way to get where you want to go. We have way overstated the impact and the edge that they provide, and the stamina of that edge. The median age in this audience is such that I think anyone here will support me on this. Once you've been out in the workforce for 5 years, certainly 10 years, people stop being impressed by where you went to school. They stop caring. When I interviewed at the Times, I was only 30. I don't remember a single conversation I had in like 20 interviews there, because they're really thorough, where anyone talked to me about going to Chapel Hill, where anyone talked to me about my 9 months in graduate school at Columbia. All they wanted to talk about was the work in front of them that I'd done from the newspapers where I'd worked before the Times. So I think you can make an argument that that Harvard and its ilk are the best, but I think right now so many people are saying that, communicating that in various ways. Let me give you one example that is fresh and that constantly amuses me. So if you read profiles of Ted Cruz, if you force yourself to, thanks, you will very quickly encounter the detail that he went to Princeton undergrad and that he went to Harvard for graduate school. If you read a profile of Bobby Jindal, the governor of Louisiana, you will probably, well, almost certainly trip across the information that he went to Brown University and that he was a Rhodes Scholar, right? That is, it's there in those stories because it bespeaks a presumption that explains their success. If you read a profile of Chris Christie, you may never learn that he went to the University of Delaware and then to Seton Hall Law School, because that wouldn't be deemed relevant, because that doesn't really explain anything, does it? Well, maybe it does. Maybe it absolutely is part and parcel of his success. You don't read that Joe Biden went to the University of Delaware and then Syracuse University for law school, but when you read about Obama, you hear right away about Harvard and Columbia. You don't hear they started at Occidental. That's edited out as if that's irrelevant. So I think we have presented, we are creating such a distorted picture right now in this country that I want to correct the picture. I want us to have a truer conversation so that our kids aren't feeling an unwarranted level of anxiety.
As we drove here, I asked my wife, I wonder how many kids he has. And what he...
Me?
Yes.
I have 0. I borrow kids from my siblings. I kind of timeshare them. Yeah.
I teach morality and social justice in a Catholic coeducational high school.
Nice.
It is nice.
Yeah, no, yeah.
It's a challenge. And
Why? Why? I mean, the social justice tradition in Catholicism is deep, long,
is
and
the
magnificent.
best part,
Yeah,
the best thing
yeah.
we got going. But they are
You guys got Dorothy Day. You guys-
Yeah,
Dorothy Day.
there we go. But both they and their parents have chosen the Catholic school system for all kinds of reasons.
Mhm.
And in my particular community, it's because it's safe and it's probably the best education their kids are going to get.
Right.
My question to you is, do you feel, because where you go is not who you'll be, do you feel that the more elite schools, and I don't know if this is an outlandish question, have more or offer more as far as that social justice morality kick, even though they all end up being CEOs and in the business world? Do you think there's more of that push in the elite schools?
No.
Okay.
Why would there be? No, I mean, in fact, I think there's a real, this isn't, you were asking more of an instruction course offering thing, but I think there's a real danger at the elite schools because although they talk a lot about socioeconomic diversity and wanting more of it, although I do think they genuinely want it, and to be, again, entirely fair, I think we're all being a little naive when we talk about colleges needing to be a greater force for social mobility and to admit more underprivileged kids when we haven't delivered to the age of 17 that many underprivileged kids who are ready for college. The failure in that regard so predates the college years that when we kind of then look at colleges and say it's your job, we're really, really being irresponsible and unfair. But anyway, going back to your question, one of the reasons I went, I'm going to kind of digress, but one of the reasons I went to UNC Chapel Hill, so I had always thought I would end up at a different kind of school. I dreamed of going to Yale. I applied to Yale Early Action. I got into Yale. And then I was offered a full merit scholarship to UNC Chapel Hill. So a big part of the reason was even though my parents could afford Yale, it wasn't going to be painless, and I didn't see how you turned down free education at a pretty darn terrific state university just for the Yale name, and I didn't want to be that person. But there was another reason, and I can't believe that I thought it at the time, because I was right, I believe, and I don't know how I had that knowledge, but I see now. I encountered a much more diverse student body and a much better glimpse of the world at UNC Chapel Hill, even though 85% of the kids there by state law were from the state, than my siblings did at Amherst, Dartmouth, Princeton. My siblings all had friends who were at least as wealthy, or in most cases wealthier, than my parents were. I remember my brother Mark going to his friend Chad's beach house in St. Croix all the time. I remember my brother Harry going to 2 different friends' ski houses all the time. My friends waited tables for extra money. They worked. I feel like at Chapel Hill, to your question, it's not a social justice answer, but it is sort of. I feel like I got an understanding, somewhat of an understanding, and that's already a pretty gilded environment, of what the world was, that I think a lot of kids coming from backgrounds of privilege into institutions of privilege that have a token level of diversity, but not really true, thorough diversity. I think that's a problem, and so I think whatever they're teaching in the classroom, there's a component missing, which is a true brushing of shoulders with a true mingling with people from all walks of life that would arouse your conscience and make you sensitive to diversity in a way that's more important than any course on social justice. Does that make sense?
It does,
Okay.
it does. I guess the other thing is, ideally, college is a place that helps you, whatever field you're in, to go out and help transform the world. There's my idealism, and I'm wondering if, besides the networking at the Ivy Leagues, which is, I think, probably its biggest selling point,
Yeah.
who you're going to be with, or who you're going to room with, and who you're going to meet. I'm just wondering if they do much to instill that in their students.
Well, I don't think any university is doing that much to instill that because we've entered an era where it's the era of the elective. So not many universities, or not many private universities, especially because they're competing for students and they're in a marketplace and they're behaving like vendors. Most of them are really focused on making that school seem as attractive as possible, and that extends from the cliched but true climbing wall all the way to boutique courses, that are not survey courses, that don't sound very hard, whether they are or not. So I think the instruction, there's very little required course. There's very little in the way of required courses and instruction that every student gets because students are being allowed, I think, to too great a degree to sculpt their own academic experience. Yeah.
You earlier commented on something that really applies to journalists, and that is that they typically don't frame a person's success who went to a state school, for
Yeah.
example,
No, I'm pleading
and put it in
guilty,
the
yeah.
story. So you've really talked about a problem that we might put in journalism
Absolutely.
camp, and is there a discussion within your profession of that issue? I mean, is your book sort of?
No, I mean, I point that out, but no, I have not heard my colleagues discuss it. No. Nor is there enough discussion about the fact that, we ran a front page story last year, right around this time, when Stanford set a new precedent in exclusivity by rejecting a higher percentage of students than any school had ever rejected. I don't think we should have put that on the front page, because even if you write that story in a flat way, you are, by dint of putting it on the front page, sending the message that Stanford has attained some heretofore unimagined pinnacle of glory. Harvard had a record number of applications this year. I guarantee you that is not unrelated to seeing Stanford on the front page with that statistic last year. I guarantee you, I don't know this, but I would bet my life that there were discussions at Harvard, even if they didn't use this script, it's what was being said. We have to make sure we get enough applications next year that we don't fall too far behind Stanford in what our acceptance rate is. Schools are equating, they're using their acceptance rates, the lowness of their acceptance rates, as bragging rights. And we as consumers in the marketplace are totally buying into it. And they will continue to do that until people vote with their feet and say, you know what, I'm not impressed with 5% acceptance rate. That doesn't, to me, equal any kind of promise of a great education. That just sounds to me like what Prada's doing when they price a handbag very expensively. They're making it something that only a few people can own. And they're making it desirable for that reason. Yeah.
Juniors and seniors receive an enormous amount of mail from all the colleges.
Because they're drumming up applications, yeah.
Yeah,
So
so-
they can reject them.
Exactly.
No, it's not just.
So when you get, obviously there's a gazillion colleges, but when your child starts getting letters from Harvard and Yale, why are they doing that? Is that just to
They're doing it.
feel good or?
No, they're doing it. Well, there's one good reason and then one bad reason. And I think more often it's the bad reason. But sometimes they don't even know which is the operative reason when they're sending out a given piece of mail. They want to expand the pool of applicants in part because they want to make sure that there are certain kinds of children. This is a stab at diversity, who are not applying simply because they don't realize it's something they can do. But more of the time, and to a greater degree, they are trying to make sure they have enough applications so that the number they accept, so that the arithmetic, the equation done, leaves them with a 6, 7, or 5% acceptance rate. Because that, in so many consumers' mind, is a proxy for desirability and quality. So that's why they're doing it. And they do it far less aggressively than schools a tier or two down, although I hate to use that language because I don't view schools that way. But decades ago, the University of Chicago used to have a very high acceptance rate, even though it was an extremely well-regarded school, because the application to get into University of Chicago was more difficult to fill out, it was more prolonged, it was more articulated than to other schools. And they were fine with that, because they knew their student body was as good. And so what? Now, that's not the case. There was a decision made at University of Chicago, we can no longer be in this higher education marketplace and wear a 35% acceptance rate next to UPenn's 12%, because people will misunderstand. Swarthmore saw their applications go down in 2014. And they researched it and they discovered it was because their supplemental essay requirements, supplemental to the Common App, were more rigorous, were more difficult than other schools. Instead of saying, well, that's fine, it means we're getting applicants who really want to be at Swarthmore, and it means we're curating a student body that's a little bit more dedicated, they cried uncle, and they made the essays easier and more in line with everybody else because they did not want to go out into the marketplace with an acceptance rate that made them look less exclusive than they needed to look. Yeah.
I also teach high school. One of the things, and I hear this all the time, and Stanford in this area is like, everybody wants to go to Stanford. And I'm always telling students, you don't really want to go to Stanford. I mean, you're not a kid who would actually do well at Stanford. You would do well other places. And what you're talking about is, and what's sad is that colleges are making, the experience of college is gone. It's really about getting,
Right.
like you said, getting the
Right.
thing. And what does that do about citizens then? It's like it's all about, accomplishing something, and then once you accomplish it, you check it off, as opposed to actually living. Because that's
Well,
what's
yeah, that's-
happening to the students.
I agree, and I would say another way you could put it, sort of, this is in some ways restating that, but it's an overlapping but similar thing. I think we're sending the message, especially when you're hiring special tutors and special
Yeah.
massagers and special primpers and fluffers and all that. You're sending two really weird messages. One is that the packaging is much more important than the substance, and I think everyone would agree our society already is way too attentive to packaging versus substance. But aren't you also telling kids you can't do this on your own?
Right, and you're also saying that the education you're getting or what we're offering you, and I'm at a private school too,
Right.
isn't enough. Like,
Right.
and
you're
these
you're
kids,
taking their attention
Yeah.
away from education. So
and these
yeah,
kids are working day and night. I mean, that's the thing that's hard for me to watch is they're going to school all day, taking really rigorous courses, and a lot of our students will say once they get into college, actually college is easier
right.
than what we're putting them through right now. And so
Right.
then you're like, what? I mean, like, what are we doing to these kids? Even kids who go to Stanford say, it's not as hard as it
Well,
was.
we're teaching them some really curious values, and
Right.
we're also taking their eye off the ball of education.
Mhm.
I mean, the whole point of this is to become more thoughtful,
Yeah.
informed, people with broader frames of reference, and how much energy is left over for that if everything is focused on hitting these various marks, on following this script
Right.
to this predetermined goal. And a lot of them never have a moment to ask what they really want to do. So I mean, the book is filled with anecdotes of kids who who went in different paths. In some ways, it's a meditation on what the real ingredients of success and contentment are. But there's a young woman in the book who talked about this in a very mature and thoughtful way. She went to I forget where she went to high school, but the point was get into a great selective school. She got into Columbia. She got to Columbia. She immediately, because she was following the script, she immediately became an econ major because that's what
People do.
that's what I mean, vis-a-vis 20, 30 years ago, that major has just, because that major is your pivot into management consulting and finance. She became an econ major. She got the exact job she was supposed to get with Bain Consulting, big salary, envy of her peers. A couple of years into it, she realized, I didn't really enjoy my college. I don't know why I studied that. I really don't enjoy what I'm doing now. And now she's studying to be a doctor at a not particularly renowned medical school in Oregon, and she's leagues happier.
Yeah.
But I really worry that we're not, by telling everyone this is the script, these are the marks you have to hit, these are the people we're going to hire or consult to help you, there's no room for people to really discover what's my passion, and to feed and hone that.
Right, because that's what I teach religion too. So that's kind of what I'm always saying to the kids. It doesn't really matter like what your passion is, because we need everything. Like, we don't just need people in finance. We need a lot of things in the world. And to be honest, I say, I don't want you to be an adult like that woman you just talked about. And I said, and there are a lot of them who wake up one day and go, I'm not sure what my life was about. And I said, you're better than that. If you need to reflect on what you're doing. And that's why I often talk about smaller colleges.
Right.
Or places where they offer something that's interesting to you, as opposed to a big school where you're going to be lost, unless you're that kind of kid. And there are those kind of kids, so that's their path.
Well, I'm not. I agree with everything you say, except I don't like that kind of assumption that
Yeah.
people are lost in a big school. I think a big school can, in many ways, be a better choice, because I think one of the lessons of the last couple of decades is you really don't know what's going to happen with the economy or the job market. And so I think it is important to at least give some consideration when you're choosing college. If you have options, and we should keep on pausing and saying if you have options, a lot of people don't.
Yeah.
You might want to think about going to a place that is flexible and sort of broad-ranging enough that if your interests change, as they almost certainly will, because very few 17-year-olds really know what they want to do with the rest of their lives. I also wish that we would talk to kids in different ways. If we spent less time talking about how to get into college. We could talk more about some of the different ways one might choose a college. And I wish in a world, in a country, whose future health and prosperity depends in no small measure on how well we manage diversity, I wish we would have a conversation with those kids who have options about maybe choosing college to be a counterpoint to everything in their life before then, right? So if they've only known one kind of milieu, go to a school that's entirely different, right? I mean, isn't that part of education, exposing yourself to different people, different viewpoints? We very seldom have that conversation with people bound for college. We only talk about the school as if it's an insular universe of its own. We don't look at how it fits into the arc of their lives and their development as hopefully people who are becoming more and more informed, more and more fluent in a diverse society, all those sorts of things. I promised I got to you next.
One of the things, I mean, there's a Pew Research report published in May of last year that said that it's not the name of the school, rather it's the mentoring at the school and how much internships, how many internships you.
I think that's actually the Gallup-Purdue index. I think they were, yeah.
And some of us instructors, you know, have taken that very seriously. So we use service learning models and to put that in our classrooms. I work at Sonoma State and at Berkeley when we desperately need me. But and so we're starting that. And I've heard this argument before too about other universities, but I'm wondering how much at these other universities that, you know, these name brand universities, that's how much social capital plays into it, you know, that you know all these really great people, and that it's not just, it's more about the student to teacher ratio, you know, and getting, you know, a teacher that you know is going to recommend you for sure, instead of at a state college where I have 150 students and I may have the time as a lecturer to give.
Well, social capital is a big part of going to those schools, but I'm not sure. Your question seems to presume that at a state school you would have a harder time forging the kind of mentor relationship with a professor that he or she might take an abiding interest that would even. I'm not sure that's true. A lot of the people I profile in the book found that because they went to schools, state universities or other schools that weren't quite as overcrowded with overachievers, they had a much easier, more direct path to professors. Most of them are people whose names you wouldn't recognize, but one of the people in the book I profile is Condoleezza Rice, and she went to the University of Denver, and she talks about how, because she was the kind of goody two-shoes who signed up for the first half hour of office hours, who made a point of reading the professor's resume and complimenting the professor on his work books. No, I mean, you laugh. I call that clever. I call that, I think that's admirable, you know. But she found that she had a closer relationship with the professors, and she ended up doing what she did because she forged an unbelievably tight relationship with Madeleine Albright's father, who was teaching at the University of Denver.
I thought that's a very good private university, though. That
University of Denver?
Yeah.
University of Denver, when Condoleezza Rice went there, probably had an acceptance rate of 60%. I don't know that for a fact, but it might have even been higher. So it's not, it's a good example of a school that would not be in the vocabulary of what brand you want or what you're pointing your kid toward. But I agree with you, you can get a fantastic education there. Yeah.
Does your book address, so as parents, there's so many colleges and universities in this country, and one of the things that people gravitate toward is the U.S. News and World Report,
Yes.
because what, you know, when it's hard to get information on schools and once they've been fed, and especially, you know, so I'm just wondering if you have anything that you recommend as an alternative way of researching schools.
Well, I mean, I mentioned the obvious book in my book, which is Colleges That Change Lives, which is now gone from being just a book to being an organization, and so if you go to their website and you get their literature, it's more than just the original colleges that were in the first book that was written. But I mean, I think it's actually a matter of just more aggressive Googling, because I can tell you that since I've begun writing more about higher education, I have a stack of books on my desk at the Times. There are at least 10 books in one stack that are all essentially like anagrams of Colleges That Change Lives. The information is out there, and in the age of the internet it's accessible. It just takes a little bit more ingenuity and creativity and stamina than going directly to the U.S. News site. The other thing I want to say about U.S. News is while I think the rankings are really destructive and corrosive and something people need to resist, what's funny is in the course of doing those rankings, U.S. News gathers a lot of very interesting information that has nothing to do with how they end up judging schools, but which is accessible for the same money you pay to go on that website and access the rankings. You can find out, and I talk about this in the book, you can find out how schools, what percentage of students at a given school at some point during their time at that school study abroad. I found that fascinating because I would want to go to a school at which more rather than fewer students did that, because they're coming back to campus with interesting stories, interesting perspectives. The fact that they ventured abroad suggests to me they have a degree of intellectual curiosity that's admirable. So, but is that something that factors into the rankings? No, but the information's there. You can find out there and other places what percentage of the students are on Pell Grants, which tells you something about the school's commitment to economic diversity. So U.S. News and World Report actually could be and is a wonderful resource that people are actually using in a very superficial way, and thus turning into, and because they're focusing on those rankings, turning it into something that's not so helpful. Yeah.
So, being a high school senior, I felt and seen the struggle that is the application process, and I've seen how inherently flawed it is. Do you have any suggestions on how colleges can like make new applications, or maybe like the Common App is a common application for many schools, or like or should each school have like their own application? What do you think?
Well, I mean, it's not going to happen. So what I think is sort of irrelevant. I think it should be a little bit more difficult. I don't think the Common App is going to go away, and I wouldn't want it to go away, because one good thing the Common App has done is it has made the process a little bit less intimidating and cumbersome and daunting for kids who we want to make sure they're considering these schools and who don't have a gazillion essay whisperers and fluffers and that. So there are good things that have come out of the Common App, and there's a way to look at it that way. That said, I do think schools should, in their supplemental material, should make an effort to try to make sure they're weeding out people who really aren't interested in that school. But they're not going to do that because, again, there's the tyranny of the acceptance rate, the low acceptance rate. But
I have just one quick more question.
Yeah.
Is there a school that does have like a holistic application that you think is like truly holistic in its?
I don't have that catalog in my brain. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
A comment and a question. First, I saw the piece in the New York Times that was by you, an excerpt from the book, including a letter.
From the Levins, yeah.
And I don't remember your connection to them, but I just want you to pass back to them the notion that it was a really powerful
lovely letter, right?
And
yeah.
I kept it, and my son's a junior, and I'll hold on to it, and I'll paraphrase it and write something similar. So thank them for that.
I'll email them and tell them that. Yeah, I keep in touch with them. Yeah, I didn't know them before. They actually wrote me. I wrote a column that was in some ways the seed of the book a little more than a year ago. And that letter, astonishingly, actually came to me in an email. They emailed me after I wrote the column, and they said, your column was very meaningful to us. It was dead on. And they're just kind of very open people. And in that email, they showed me that letter. I didn't know at the time they would let me share it with the world. And I didn't know that I was going to want to. But when I then circled back to them later and said, first, can I interview you and learn a little bit more about your situation? And second, can I print that letter? And they said yes, which I thought was really lovely of them and lovely of their son, because they obviously had to ask him if he was okay with it. I've never met him. I've met them now because I spoke at their school. But I think I'm going to meet their son in a couple weeks.
And you can explain to the rest of the audience about that letter in a moment. But I also want to ask you a question, which is thinking about this metric of acceptance rate is very self-perpetuating, because you read those numbers
right.
and your kids freak out and they apply to that many more places,
right.
and so all the numbers come down, and it's very
right.
much a cycle. And so the metrics that really we want to pay attention to, you made reference to what's embedded in the U.S. News and World Report, and it's worth, I think, thinking about what else might be useful. For example, I hear of schools where kids go in as pre-meds because that's the next sort of goal, and they become poets.
Right.
And photographers and all these other things, and that's the kind of thing I'd love for schools to publish.
Yeah, I don't think anybody measures that. That would be pretty hard to measure. I mean, you can find dropout rates. You can find like what percentage of a given school's incoming freshmen graduate in 5 years or 6 years. I don't know if students haven't declared a major. I mean, you'd have to almost do a poll of students to figure out how many people changed. There was a really interesting. It was a tiny. and it showed the opposite of what you're talking about. But it was a teeny tiny study done at Harvard by some graduate students of the Graduate School of Education, and I described it in the book. And it was called the funnel study or whatever. And they followed, I think it was 22. So it was a really small sample set, unfortunately. They followed 22 kids through their arc at Harvard, and what they found, and this speaks to the anecdote I told you before about the girl at Columbia. What they found was that no matter what they'd come in interested in, they ended up leaving more likely than not in one of those preordained professions, because the climate, the sort of the pack had spoken so powerfully in its behavior to them that they began imitating it. And the reason they called it the funnel study was because they described what happened at a school like Harvard as all of these people being funneled into just one profession, one direction, one mindset. It's not that meaningful and doesn't carry that much weight because it was such a small sample set, but even so, I think it's an interesting thing to look at and think about. Yeah.
I think there's a chance that universities, like starting with Stanford or Harvard, would stop reporting their total applications.
No.
And acceptance rate.
No. I mean, this is like when the U.S. and Russia were both like, no, it really is exactly like that. No one's going to disarm unless everyone else.
But it must discourage some kids. If you're a lesser privileged kid and you see that 95% of kids get rejected, those kids are probably not applying and not as interested because they think they'll get rejected. So you think Harvard and Stanford could say, look, we're not going to report that anymore. We know we're at the top of the heap, and this will give us more kids from different backgrounds who will apply.
No, I just don't think it's going to happen. No, because if they got the more kids, they would want to crow about that. So if they didn't publish the acceptance rate as a way of encouraging more to apply, and by the way, like they're going to have to hire extra people to look at those, then they wouldn't be able to crow about their bounty because it would contradict the disarmament they'd just done.
Yeah. So they don't have a conscience, really.
Hmm?
Schools already have a conscience.
Not in that way. I mean, in other ways. I mean, in other ways. And if we're going to be really fair, in other ways, if you are a desperately poor person, and you happen to be, in another way, fortunate enough to have gotten the kind of high school education where you've done well enough, on ACT or SAT, and you have a good transcript and all that. Harvard is probably the most affordable school for you because they have so much money that they can give you the kind of free ride that another school can't. And that's why I say, like, what we really have to do is pay attention to what we're doing. I mean, we have to do a lot of things, but we can't let the discussion about getting more underprivileged kids into these universities, we can't let that blind us to the fact that the much more urgent thing is what's happening K through 12, because often the game is lost by the time they're 17, or by the time they're 13. Yeah.
Do you think that shrinking middle class has anything to do with the way parents are just pushing their kids?
I think it has everything to do with it. So I think it used to be, if you went, I think the main driver of all this, because I think parents get beaten up in this for the way they push their kids, and I beat them up plenty in the book. But I also say the following, and I also believe the following. Parents want a great future for their kids, and they're doing their best to figure out, what that is and how to help their kids get there. I think the fact that for more than 10 years now, in a really historically anomalous way, a majority of Americans say the country's on the wrong track. I think the fact that they both hear about and see rising income inequality makes them feel the stakes of whether you land on the haves or the have-nots. Those stakes are greater than ever. It used to be consistently that when you asked American parents, do you think your children will have a better life than you did? Very clear majority said yes. That's no longer the case. I think that context of sort of economic and future pessimism is the main driver of this. Parents feel like, I cannot afford for my kid not to hit all of those marks we talked about because I don't want them losing out in the future, and I'm uncertain about the future. Even if they don't say that, even if they don't say all those sentences to themselves, that's what they're feeling, I believe. I mean, does that ring true to?
Yeah, I think you're right.
You had a question.
Well, two. One is, do you think in the fall, right around application time, newspapers like the New York Times would do profiles of, take 10 or 12 very well-known successful people, none of whom went to one of the 6 elites or whatever, to talk about why I went where I went and what I got out of it, to try to kind of break through this notion that this is the only road to
Right.
success. But, and, you know, to really focus on
Right.
that at that particular time of the year.
I think that would be great,
Yeah.
and maybe
Yeah.
I'll suggest, I mean, seriously, that's why I do the book. I mean, the book is like, you know, that's why Condi Rice is in the book.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
That's why Howard
So
Schultz is in the book.
How great would it be for the New York Times, the most influential newspaper?
I'll take your word for it.
You know, to just say, you know, it's college application time. Let's, you know, here's some real stories, some narratives that could then be
I
shared.
think I'm serious. I'll suggest it because I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think it'd be I think if we mean for a certain portion of our journalism to be public service, I think that would be a public service.
Yeah,
of the highest
I
order.
do too. So that- Yeah, and then all the teachers whoever could show. And then, so that's number one. Number two, what would you like to hear from the presidential candidates about higher education?
Well, I don't know, because what I'd really like to hear from them about more is lower education. Because I really mean it when I say that we can't fix higher education until we fix lower education. It feels to me like a lot of the discussion about what we want colleges to do seems to be deaf and blind to what they're able to do at that latest stage in the game. But I guess other than that, I would like them to address the issue of affordability, but in a way that didn't frame college solely as a vocational school. So you have some politicians in Washington. Marco Rubio is one of them. He's actually come out with some interesting policy papers on higher education. He's teamed in that with, oh my God, my mind is failing me. Oregon Senator. Thank you. They've actually kind of introduced some stuff together, and it's very interesting. They talk about various ways in which to restructure student loans, various ways to make it more affordable, but like the Obama administration's rating proposal, it's all a little bit too focused on the notion of colleges proving a return on investment. And I understand where that's coming from, but I wish there were I wish they would look at a way to tweak that so it didn't presuppose college was a vocational school. Because I really do believe you can't know right now what skills people are going to need 10 years from now. But you can know that if you make them more intellectually agile, they'll be better across the whole arc of their lives at picking up skills, period. If you can turn them on to learning. I had a wonderful, sometimes journalism affords you some really sweet, like wrinkles in your life, and I had one of those recently where I wrote a column about the class and the professor that had meant the most to me in college. And I had never gotten to know that professor well, and I certainly hadn't kept in touch with her. She found me through email, and she'd gone from Chapel Hill to UPenn. And I went down to Philadelphia and I had dinner with her, and I wrote a second column, and we talked about what college should be for. And she quoted a student of hers, and I never heard a better phrase, a better definition of what college should be for. That student said, college is for developing the muscle of thoughtfulness. And so back to your question, I wish the political discussion of this wouldn't get so far toward the vocational that it ignored the role of college as a place to develop the muscle of thoughtfulness. This probably should be the last question. Yeah.
Talking about affordability, is not one very obvious answer and solution to all that online education?
Well, that's what a lot of people are saying, and it's one solution, but I don't think we know yet, really, how effective for how many people online education is going to be. I mean, it's really in its infancy. I'm halfway through the terrific book, which I recommend, The End of College. I don't agree with everything in it, but I think it's worth reading on these issues by Kevin Carey. It came out a couple weeks before mine. He talks a lot about that. I mean, I've been trying to keep up in my reading on online education, and I don't feel like I've yet gotten anything like a clear picture of what its true potential is or what its true accountability is.
There's been some disastrous results at San Jose State, for instance.
Yes.
So, yeah. Thank you all. If you want me to sign a book, I'm happy to do it. Thank you for coming and listening to me.